Good evening, colleagues, and welcome to our blast session. Today's topic of today's session is writing an abstract, and I wish to welcome you all this evening to the session. Um, a brief introduction. I am a colleague with Professor Tennyson Gushini. My name is Professor Nodi Jinabai, and like himself, I also have a public health background, both a research track record and also a public health background. And also, both of us have been involved in these master's and doctoral training programs for just over 1.5 decades. In South Africa and even internationally, and we have been training many cohorts of research students, both at the master's and doctoral level and at other levels also, over quite a long period of time, particularly focusing on research methodology. So that's my brief background. I'm currently teaching at UNISA as well as at several other universities in South Africa, mainly in the field of research development at master's and doctoral level. So that's very briefly about myself. Today's session is going to be on writing an abstract. So I will now start by just sharing the screen and start with our presentation. Okay, colleagues, I'm sure that you can see the slide, the first slide. So looking at writing an abstract, just by way of introduction, what I need to just stress is that there are different types of abstracts that we can write. So I will be covering at least 3 or 4 different types of abstracts. And the first part of my presentation will be talking about what are the different types of abstracts and what is the objective and purpose of writing the abstracts, and there are different purposes for that. Secondly, I will then be going into the different types of abstracts that are available, and then going into a lot of detail about the nuts and bolts, the specific aspects of how to write that abstract, both in terms of grammar, language, etc., the structure of an abstract, the content of an abstract, and the size limits, etc., etc. So that will be the main part of my presentation this evening. And then the last part, I will be just ending with a session, very 1 or 2 slides on some tips in terms of how to write for different target audiences and the different ways in which, particularly, how you can get an abstract accepted. So starting with how to write an abstract, we need to talk about first and foremost that one of the major purposes of writing an abstract is either writing an abstract for a scientific peer-reviewed journal articles for a national or international journal, peer-reviewed journal, scientific journal, or you can be writing an abstract for a conference proposal where you have to submit an abstract for them to accept your paper and accept your presentation and then invite you to do either a poster or an oral presentation at a conference. So those are the 2 main types of abstracts that we would write, and both of them have many aspects that I will be covering, which will be common to either a scientific paper, journal article, or a conference abstract. Another third type of abstract, which I'm not going to cover in much detail, is where you may be writing a grant proposal for funding or some other purposes, but predominantly as researchers, we often are writing grant proposals. And again, you would need to have what may be termed an executive summary or a summary at the beginning of the grant proposal, which again is very similar to an abstract, but that will have a different set of implications. So for the purpose of today's presentation, I will be talking about the two primary types of abstracts that you'll be writing as a researcher, as an academic, and that is a scientific paper for publication or an abstract for a conference proposal to be accepted. So that is what I'm going to be covering. The structure and the purposes of the different abstract styles will also be covered, and particularly the three types of abstracts. And then I will be sharing with you how to refine an abstract which you may be currently working on or that we can uh, help you with. So the first couple of slides I'm going to be sharing with you is particularly for reviewers of a journal article or reviewers of a conference organizers who will be reviewing those two types of abstracts. So the first step that will happen in the review process that you need to know as you start preparing your abstract is called editorial triage. Editorial triage is where the reviewers of those two groups of reviewers that I've mentioned will be looking at your abstract, and they will be deciding based on your abstract whether your abstract would be rejected outright, or whether your abstract will be sent back, or whether they will allow your abstract to go to the next step, which is the review process, and reviewers to look at that. So the criteria that this review panel will be using, the editorial triad, will be, is your abstract first and foremost within the scope of a journal's interest and the actual scope of the journal. So the first step in writing an abstract is to be at an early stage identify your journal or the conference that you're attending, and particularly for a scientific peer-reviewed journal article, to look in a lot of detail what is the scope of the journal and what are the requirements of the journal as you start writing the abstract. So that is a very, very important first step that you need to undertake in terms of understanding and framing and structuring and the content of your abstract. Is it within the scope of the journal? Then does the article and of course your abstract have a very clear message? And in subsequent slides, I will cover the details of that. Is the abstract, and is there any original novel, or is there something that is niche and unique that you must capture in your abstract? Uh, I'll talk a little bit about the 100 to 300 word limit that you would have for your abstract. So is there anything that is unique or original that you need to capture in the abstract? And then, is it important? Is it true in the sense of particularly for experiments? And then is it relevant to the readers of the journal or the participants in that conference? So these are important criteria that you have to look at even before you start putting pen to paper and start thinking about that, because you have to ensure that these guidelines, criteria, will serve as guidelines, as a framework for you to draft your abstract and to be able to then shape the content of the abstract. So essentially, in marketing terms, you have to sell yourself to get through this editorial triage. In addition, the editors or the reviewers, uh, if they cannot work out what is the single take-home message in your abstract, they will reject the paper or they will not invite you to the conference. So what is your message? That is the key. And remember, in the previous slide, I talked about, is there something unique, novel, or original, or something that's outstanding in the work that you've done, in the paper you're going to be writing, which you need to capture in the abstract? They will also reject it if you haven't convinced them of the study's importance. So again, at the very early stage, as you start beginning to thinking about how to draft and formulate your abstracts, these are the important triage criteria you need to look at. And the first step is, what is the message and what is the key single take-home aspect that is unique, novel, original, etc., outstanding that you want to capture, etc. Another positive and negative development that I need to share with you in abstract submissions is that almost overwhelmingly the majority of the journals and even conference proceedings are now online submissions, and this has lots of advantages and some disadvantages also, which I will share. So again, as you're starting to sit down and start thinking about how to write your abstract and how to shape it, you need to be aware of the what does it mean for an online submission. So it's often a completely electronic submission process, which means that you would need to obviously then go onto the internet, click on the abstract submission forms, and then little later I'll talk about the different types of abstracts, the descriptive, structured, etc. And then you have to then start putting the content, the messages that you want to put across in that electronic submission process. And often they would have the abstract laid out on the screen as a screen page. The article is then submitted online if it's an article, or the abstract, first and foremost, the abstract is submitted online, and all of the review procedures then happens online. So the advantage is that it speeds up the editorial process. So the beauty of this for you as an academic, as a researcher, as somebody who's submitting an abstract for a paper or a conference proceedings, the advantages for you are that it's very rapidly you can have a turnaround and feedback, because not only are the editors or the reviewers able to receive your online abstract submission electronically within seconds, within minutes, within hours of you pressing the submit button. Not only that, but they're able to immediately screen that and then make a decision to say this is sufficiently suitable in terms of content, structure, scope of the conference or the paper, to submit it and then forward it to the review panel, and then very quickly you can get a feedback as to whether your abstract has been accepted or not and whether you can proceed. So it speeds up the editorial process, and it's invaluable for authors, particularly like us in developing country context, where we don't have necessarily a lot of secretarial staff, etc., a lot of time to be able to spend on that. And we need to know quickly whether our abstract is going to be accepted or not. So that's part of the editorial triad and the online submissions. So editors and reviewers are looking for original and innovative research that will add to the field of the study. So going back to the earlier slide, I talked about what is your key message. That is the criteria that you would now start thinking about as you start drafting the first part of your abstract. So for research-based papers, ensure that you have sufficient numbers, particularly if it's a quantitative study, to justify sound statistical conclusions. Remember, it's not just original, creative, etc., innovative research, but also it must have breadth and depth in terms of the actual abstract. And of course, the abstract is the window through which your study and your final paper is going to be viewed. So that's for research-based papers. It's important to substantiate the importance and the significance and the originality and the innovation that is captured in the abstract. And then for larger studies, it may be important to produce one important key findings in a high quality journal with a high impact factor, rather than a number of average incremental papers. In certain sectors, this is called the salami effect, where you take a large study and you try to get 3 or 4 different papers of different parts of the data sets. So increasingly, editors and conference reviewers are looking for important research paper which has got the key important findings, rather than a number of average incremental papers. So these are some early tips that we need to start thinking about as you begin to sit down. So now let's go on to the structure of a paper and the abstract. Remember, repeatedly I will be saying that the abstract is the window or the lens through which your project, your research project, your research study, and your research paper is being looked at. It's a synopsis, it's a very tight, succinct summary of your entire paper. So the entire paper could be 3 to 5 or 7,000 words, whereas the abstract is between 150 to about 300 or 350 words. So the abstract is a synopsis and a window through which the reviewers, the editors will be looking at to decide whether they need to submit and allow you to go further. So in terms of the structure of the paper and the abstract, the scientific writing, academic scientific writing follows a fairly structured and rigid process and structure and format. And this format has been developed over a long period of time, and this structure that I'm going to be shared with you can be read at several levels. So now let us talk about how will the abstract influence whether the decisions of the reviewers, the editors, and the conference people, how will that abstract impact on and how will the abstract be used by these reviewers? So the first level, some people and reviewers will just look at the title and decide on the basis of the title. So the abstract and the title of the abstract are very important, which we'll talk about a little later, of how to write a catchy title. So the first thing will be people will look at the title of the abstract and make a decision and whether this should be referred further to other reviewers. Other people may read only the title and the abstract, and this is very, very important. I'll talk about that just now. And then others will read the paper for a deeper understanding. So the structure of the paper and the abstract, particularly the abstract, will be seen and looked upon at a different levels. At the first level, reviewers may just look at the title and on the basis of the title, reject or accept and take it further. Secondly, other people, many people, in fact, a large proportion of the scientific audience will only look at the title and the abstract. And the reason for that is many of you know this, there are every minute, every hour, every day, not just tens of thousands, but possibly even millions of journal articles are being churned out daily, weekly, and monthly. And it's not possible even for somebody in a very narrow, restricted field of study and scope of study to be able to keep abreast of all the journal articles. And therefore, I will repeatedly stress this, the abstract serves as the window or the lens, which is 100 to 300 words, and many people now just look at the abstract and then decide whether they're going to read the rest of the paper, partly because there's such a volume of papers and scientific publications. So if you just take one example, if you talk about the current COVID pandemic, many of you probably are already aware from the table of contents that you get in your inbox all the time, the thousands and the tens of thousands of COVID-related articles that have come out just in the last 1.5 years, and it's not possible to keep abreast. So the abstract then serves as a mechanism through which all of us in the scientific community, in the academic community, are able to keep abreast by just reading the abstract, getting a snapshot of it, and getting a sense of what it is. The other thing about the abstract, which I'll talk about very briefly later, but let me touch on it now. The key words in the abstract, the title, the content of the abstract, and the keywords that will be extracted, which will be then stored on electronic databases. So the keywords then serve as a mechanism for people to use, the academic and scientific community to use to screen that particular abstract and decide how to go further and whether to go on to reading the paper for a deeper understanding. So that is important to bear in mind as we're now starting to sit down. Okay, now the next 1 or 2 slides, I'm just going to very briefly touch on where does the abstract fit in the paper. And as you can see clearly, on the left-hand side are the different sections and then the purposes. And in the middle, after the title, the authors and the abstract, those are the first 3 sections that we will have in a paper. And the title clearly describes the contents. authors, of course, the institution and the country, etc., the university, etc., and then, of course, the abstract, which is the window or the lens or the synopsis of what was done. And the rest of the paper is the introduction, methods, results, etc., which I will not go into. So it's important that the abstract, the title, authors, and abstract, the first three sections are very important for the entire paper. And the earlier slides, I talked about triage, editorial triage, and how this will be undertaken. And in this slide, I just give you an overview of the review process. And the first step after you've submitted the paper and confirmed receipt is the initial decision by the editor based on the abstract, and whether that will be then accepted for further review or rejected, and you get a rejection letter. So these two slides just gives you a sense of why the abstract is so important in being able to do that. So now let us go on to the abstract itself. As I've said, indicated, many journals now base the decision on the abstracts alone, and sadly many authors write the abstract in a great rush, often as an afterthought, which is very sad, because often if the abstract is badly written, a very good paper could be rejected on the basis of a badly written abstract, or your conference proceedings will be rejected. Therefore, it should be a concise standalone piece with a very clear message, as we've said earlier. The abstract must clearly and accurately reflect the full text of the paper, and then answer questions like why was the study undertaken, what was done, what were the findings, and what were the conclusions. So that's a quick overview of what is the content of the abstract and why it is important, because journals base the decisions increasingly on that abstract. So an abstract is a snapshot or a brief summary of a thesis or a conference presentation or a scientific peer-reviewed journal article, and some aims of the abstract of a journal can cover several different objectives and aims. Historically, it contextualizes the research in that scope of the journal. So the first aim of an abstract, it must contextualize what is the research in the area or the scope of the journal that you are covering and you are targeting, or the scope of the conference that you want to attend. Then it must concisely present a problem or a research question and your response to it. And remember, earlier on I talked about and used the words original, innovative. So what is the original innovative research question, or that is unique research question, and what was your response to it? So your abstract content must then state clearly what was the unique, original, innovative problem, area, problem, research question, and how did you address that, and what was your response to that. It must then briefly outline the methods used in the data collection and analysis, and I'll come back to those sections also. Then very briefly, what are the key findings? Not all the findings, not all the results section. What are the key highlights of the key findings? And then very briefly discuss or interpretation and the significance of those key findings, and then possible implications of the findings and relevance. The other word is relevance, and significance of the contribution to research in the field, and then possibly indicate the limitations of the research and prospects for and the direction for future research. So that covers the content of the abstract. So now that is what an abstract is all about. And the key words is that it is a snapshot or a window through which your entire research project and your entire research study is viewed by the reviewers. Okay, so let us now look at each of them in greater detail. First and foremost is the word count. And again, I'm just doing a generic presentation for today, but I need to stress that you remember right in the beginning, I said the first step is you need to look closely at the journal, the scope of the journal, and what are the requirements of the abstract in that electronic. Often it's an electronic submission. So what are the requirements and what is the word count requirements? Usually it's around 150 to 200 words, but there are some abstracts that can go up to 300 or 350. So the first key nitty-gritty nuts and bolts issue is to stay within the word count of the journal article or the conference proceedings, 150 up to maybe 300 words. So you have to summarize the problem, the method, the results, and the conclusions and the significance within that 150 word count. So that's the first specific task that you have. Next, the reader can decide whether or not to read the whole entire article based on that abstract and the significance of the abstract. Together with the title, the abstract should be able to stand on its own, and that's very, very important, that there must be sufficient information in the title and the abstract to be able to give the reader a very good overview within the 150 to 200 word count limit of what is your research project all about. And then many authors write the abstract last, right at the end, so that it actually captures and reflects the contents of the research study and of the paper that you're presenting or that you're writing the abstract for. So those are now very specific areas when you're now starting to write the abstract. First and foremost, let's talk about some ground rules for writing the abstract as you now starting to write. Avoid long sentences, long words, and sometimes passive tense. Now, again, I must just caution you here, you would have to look closely at the requirements for the journal that you're submitting to. Some journals require to write in the first tense, some in the present tense, or the passive past tense. Some also require to allow you to write in the first person, second person, or the third person, and I'll come back to that. So an example would be you can either say we concluded or it can be concluded. So you would have to look specifically at the requirements of the journal to decide which sense, passive tenses, and whether it's the first person, second person, or the third person, what is the style of that you would have to write in terms of the language and the scientific content and the style that you would choose. You need to look at one or two complex ideas maximum per sentence. Very short sentences, on average 20 words, not longer than 50 words, cutting out unnecessary adjectives, avoiding jargon is very, very important to avoid jargon and use short and simple words and avoid double negative. Malaria is not uncommon, is an example of a jargon. Also, with jargon goes acronyms. If you're using terms and acronyms that are not common and popularly known, so for example, in South Africa, SA is popularly known, but if you're targeting an international journal, the acronym SA may not be all that well known, etc. So avoid jargon and also be very careful about acronyms that you're going to be using. Now let us look at the basic logic of writing the abstract. It follows what is known as the IMRAD situation. That format, that model, IMRAD stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion, which is in the middle of the slide, and each one of that section. So the abstract, as a snapshot, as a window, must capture what is below that. It must capture the introduction, study site if necessary, the methods, results, and discussion. So within colleagues, within your 150 to 200 to 350 word, within the 350 word limit, your abstract and title, which is right on the top, must capture what is in the middle. Introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusions, and references, etc. You don't put references in the abstract. So the basic logic must follow this particular model, and the abstract and title at the top captures what is in the middle, the introduction, methods, results, and the discussion. And you would need to then stay within that particular word limit. Looking at the title and the keywords, I've mentioned already and briefly touch on the fact that the keywords will be extracted. So in addition to writing the abstract, you'll be asked to write between 3 to 5 keywords, which will then be captured in the electronic databases. And it's very important that the keywords capture the essence of your abstract. So first and foremost, the title must describe the paper's content clearly and precisely, and also capture and include some of the keywords which will be then captured by the electronic databases. The title and keywords is an advertisement for the article. Remember, I mentioned several times, given the volumes of articles that are published, it's not possible for everybody to read everything, and therefore the title and the keywords and the abstract would serve as an advert for your study and your research project and for your article. Avoid abbreviations and jargon, and search engines and indexing databases depend on the accuracy of the title, since they would then use the keywords to identify the relevant articles, and they're very important for the literature review for other scientists and others to read your article and access that. Make it compelling. The title and the keywords must be concise and informative, very brief, but also capture the essence of that middle part which I talked about, the introduction, methods, results, and the discussion. Should contain the most important words related to the topic. It must excite the reader without giving away the punchline. So it must be, unfortunately to use the word sexy, it must entice the reader without giving away the punchline. It must also be cautious, and particularly in research, we must not overtly sensationalize, etc. And then some journals now insist on including information on the study design, which we'll talk about just now. So the first part now of the nuts and bolts is the title and the keywords and what are the criteria and how you go about doing that. The next part of the abstract is the research question. You need to know, let the reader know explicitly what is the research question, what is unique, original, innovative about the research question, the problem statement, the problem area, the scope that you are addressing. That sentence about the research question, the problem statement, sets up an expectation in the reviewers and the researchers for the rest of the paper or the grant if you're writing that. You must use explicit phrases, use question words, and then it must state if there's a hypothesis involved, what is the hypothesized effect, and identify the types of variables and the study design. So moving on from the title and the keywords, what is the research question, which is the next part within the 300-word limit? What is that paragraph or one or two sentences which captures what was the study all about, the primary and secondary research question, and what were the effects that you're looking for, what are the types of variables and study design? This is just an example. I'm not going to go through that. You'll have the slides of some of the words and phrases that you could use on the left and some of the functions of that. So I'm not going to go through the details, but this gives you some examples of what are some key words and phrases that we would use in the abstract that helps you to capture that. The next part in that abstract, as you start moving from the title down to the research question, and the first part or then the second part of the abstract, which is what were the research question, what is the scope of that abstract, what is the problem statement, is what is your voice. So your voice, that is what is your key findings and what is original or unique or original or innovative in this abstract, in your study, that you need to capture in the abstract. And that is the deciding factor that will determine whether it goes past the editorial triage or the conference reviewers, etc. So, and there are different styles of writing the abstract and the papers. I mentioned earlier, some reviewers and editors will accept the first person, the active voice, I found, etc., etc. Other people will accept the plural of that, we found. Others would prefer a passive style of writing. These are styles of writing. It was found that rather than I and we. So it's not first person or second person, but a passive voice, or an impersonal third person. The authors found, or it was found that. So colleagues, these are writing styles that you need to determine for yourself from reading the scope of the journal, and how the author, the editors of the journal want you to write the writing style. That will determine which writing style you choose. And different journals will have different writing styles, and that was why right in the beginning, I talked about the editorial triad. What tenses should be used? And also now the content, you talked about the body of the abstract. What tense should be used? Common tenses are we show, or we can describe what the author is trying to show, or we can describe a common opinion of view. The phenomenon is essentially random. So the first one is personal, we. The second is more neutral, third person, the phenomenon. We can also refer to action carried out in the experiments. We can say, we show that such and such is the case, or you can say, it was revealed, or it was shown that. So these are present simple, and a second style common tense that we use will be past simple. We can describe what they did, the authors examined and found that. So these are two tenses that you would need to think about as to which one would you want to use and what style. And remember, for the previous slide and this slide, the author's instructions will guide you as to what you would then do. Okay, colleagues, so I started by talking about the topic, the title, etc., etc. I gave you some guidelines about grammar and language and the content, etc. Now let's go on to the different types of abstracts that we have. We essentially could have a descriptive, informative, or structured abstract, and I'll go through each one of them very briefly to give you that. So descriptive abstract is usually very short, 100 words. Informative abstracts are longer, and a structured abstract I'll go into would have different settings, etc. So descriptive abstracts indicate the type of information that is going to be found in the article. So it just describes, and often it will indicate what will be written in the form of a single paragraph and the type of information that you would capture and what were the main findings in your study, in your project, etc. It avoids making judgments about the information in the abstract. You do that, judgments are left to the main article, not in the abstract. It does not provide too much of results or conclusions. It does have keywords which may include the purpose, methods, and scope, and more or an outline of your work rather than a summary, and usually very brief, usually around 100 words. So that's the first type of abstract. The second type of abstract is the informative abstract, which covers all the essential points of the paper: the background, the purpose, the scope, the methods, results, findings, and conclusions. So the difference is that descriptive abstract is descriptive abstract is brief and just says what were an overview of the study. Informative gives a little bit more detail of the sections: background, purpose, methods, results, etc. Often comprised of one paragraph, but could be more, and longer, could be between 200 to up to 500 words, and often used in science, engineering, and psychology. So that's the second type of abstract. The third type of abstract is a structured abstract. So on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, if we start, an unstructured abstract or a descriptive will be written in a format similar to a narrative summary, the descriptive abstract, which I've talked about firstly, on the right, the unstructured abstract. It consists of one paragraph without necessarily any headings for objective, methods, etc. And the readers need to have more time to locate the relevant information in an unstructured descriptive abstract. In contrast to the left-hand side, the structured abstract is divided into very clear sections with distinct headings. And I'll show you some of those in the next few slides. The headings usually consist of a very structured format. It must have objectives, aims and objectives, methods or study design, briefly some results, and some very brief discussion and conclusion. These are the headings. And then it assists in a quick understanding, used predominantly in medicine, health sciences, and scientific and engineering publications. So colleagues, these are the two types of abstracts that you would have. So an example of a structured abstract will be, first structure heading will be purpose, It must summarize the main findings from the research on a structured abstract. Methods, a brief narrative review of study design and the tools, questionnaires you've used again. Results, most abstracts are informative and require a very brief results, the key findings, just the key findings, without giving away too much. Conclusions, what are the main variations, main themes, what are the main results and main implications, interpretation of that. And then the keywords, which I've spoken about. So a structured abstract will have these headings already in that electronic database, and you would be required to stay within the 300 plus or minus 300 word limit to then complete these headings: purpose, methods, results and data, conclusions, etc. And just to repeat, today most abstracts are now electronic, and most abstracts will then give you a structured format and will give you the word count limits and allow you to then fill in and type it on your screen on the web page as you open for the journal or the conference proceedings. So colleagues, those are the three types of abstracts that I've covered and given you some direction and guidelines as to what they are. Now I'm going to move towards conclusion and giving you some abstract writing tips and to talk about what are some of the other things that you need to take into account as you are drafting the content of your abstract. So thus far, we have covered the beginning part of the abstract, who's the audience and who do you have to satisfy and what are the criteria you have to satisfy. What is the middle part of the abstract, the actual content, the nuts and bolts. And now let's look at some additional tips. Many students and researchers use search engines to look for information, and therefore in the search engine, the title of your article is the most interesting element, and the key words or the key phrases in your title and in your abstract are critical. So it is best to focus on a maximum of 3 to 4 different keywords or phrases in the abstract. The keywords, the key concepts, the key terms that were used in your research study, in your research project. So that is very, very important that you capture that both in the title and throughout that 300 plus or minus 300 words limit, etc. Keep a very consistent order. Ideas must be well organized. Each paragraph should just capture one topic. So if you're going for the structured abstract, each one will give you the aims and objectives will be one paragraph and one or two, well, that's the topic. The next section, each paragraph will be what were your methods, your study design, and what were your study instruments, one paragraph. Next, what were your key findings, one paragraph. And then lastly, what were the conclusions and what was the interpretation of that data, etc. So each paragraph should capture just one topic. Each sentence should just have one single key critical idea: original, innovative, exciting, etc. The paragraph structure, the first sentence of each paragraph should capture the main message. Don't avoid jargon, avoid wishy-washy, talking about other issues, just the main message in each paragraph. The topic sentences should be followed by supporting sentences, again, not more than one or two, staying within the word count limit. Explicit relationship must exist between the different sentences. And then the relationship must also exist between paragraphs and between sections. So what we're saying there is not only must you have a consistent order, but you must also show a very clear, logical, structured, systematic flow in the abstract from each section, from the title to the aims and objectives, to the methods and the study design, to the main findings, key findings, down to the conclusions, etc. That's consistent order, well organized, and also must be systematic and must have a flow that must go. Then, colleagues, just to conclude then, these are the steps that we need to follow. Carefully reread the entire paper without interruption as you start preparing to write the abstract. Read each section of your paper, your research study, and reduce each section to one or two key sentences: original, innovative, exciting, etc. Thirdly, reread these sentences to see that no vital information has been excluded. Next, check to see whether you can slightly expand each of these points in the draft abstract. Remember, you will go through several drafts of the abstract as you go down from maybe 1,000 words to about 600 words to eventually keep going down towards your 300 to 250 word count limit. Check the word length and adjust as you start writing. Edit and check the flow of the transition and the flow of the ideas. Remember the last few slides, the flow of the ideas and systematic logical flow. Then extract from the abstract what are the key words, and then see if you can capture those keywords obviously in the title. Check whether the title matches the content of the abstract and keep rewriting the title until it captures what I've said earlier on, but also captures and matches the content of the abstract, and then do a final edit and proofreading. On the last point, you may then want to then give it to your relatives, family members, your work colleagues, your other scientific and academic colleagues to read and critically edit the abstract, and ask somebody else who's not read or familiar with your study to be able to help you to remove certain words or to make sure the flow is there, the logic is there, etc., etc. So colleagues, in conclusion, what I've covered for you thus far started by talking about the first step is to look at the scope of the journal or the scope of the conference that you're submitting and preparing your abstract, to be very clearly focused on what is the scope and what are the requirements for that abstract, for that journal, or for that conference. That's the first starting point. I called it the editorial triad. Then I went on to talk about the different elements of the abstract and writing, the nuts and bolts of writing, the content of that, starting with the title, and the three different types of abstracts that you have. And then we went on to look at how we would need to look very carefully at the styles of writing the abstract, bearing in mind that each different journals, different conference will have different styles of writing in the first person, second person, third person, in the personal tense, past tense, present tense, etc., etc., the writing style from the content. And then lastly, how you would then write the abstract, first starting with maybe up to 1,000 words and then gradually editing it down to within the 200 to 300, 400 word count limit, etc., and being able to do that. So I will now stop there and then we will take questions and go on to so colleagues, I'm open now to go on to the question and answer session. Right. I'm happy to now take any questions and clarify any aspect of the presentations, colleagues. Yes. First question, what would be the most used abstract for a law paper? So for legal journals, again, firstly, general response would be you would need to look at the law journal that you're submitting to. Usually, legal papers would follow possibly a structured framework, a structured abstract. So from firstly starting with the scope of the journal and the requirements from the editors of the journal. They would guide you as to what writing style and what the format and content of the abstract would be. My understanding would be that often law journals would prefer a structured abstract following on the different headings that I've given you. So they would start with the introduction, would be um, not necessarily a research question, but what would be the key legal issue that you are covering in that paper? What was the key legal issue? Was it a legal principle, constitutional principle? Was it the criminal justice law? What principle and what aspect of that principle did you investigate in that review or research, legal research that you did? Then from that introduction, clearly outlining the legal principle, what are the implications, what are the legal data that you collected, and how did you go about investigating that legal principle or the legal concept or the legal practice that exists in law? How did you go about investigating that? What data did you collect? Who did you interview? Did you do case records, for example? In law, you could easily do studies, master's and doctoral studies on case reviews. Cases, for example, one very popular area of legal research in my field in public health is medical legal cases. I'm sure many of you know that our government faces medical legal claims against the Department of Health, and a lot of research is being done on case reviews of the case records of patients from a medical legal perspective. So you would review those cases, and then from that cases you would extract certain structured format. So from a medical legal example that I'm using, you would look at, for example, the socio-demographic profile of patients. You will extract what were the clinical examination, what did the doctors and nurses do that is recorded in the case record of the patient. And then you would extract what were their findings, what were the clinical examination, the findings, and then you would be looking at what investigation they did and what was the clinical outcome in that case report or the case file of that particular patient. So that would be an example of the results section, and you would extract. And once you've got the results, the discussion section, using the example of medical legal cases, the discussion section will be looking at liability. Is there any liability? So that will be the discussion section. What is the liability? What is the implication and that you'll capture in one or two sentences in the abstract? And then the last thing is what is the finding, or what will be the potential judgment or the implication of that for the courts, etc. So that would be an example of the structure, the content, the style, some data that you would capture, and that would be the abstract that you'll write, probably within the 3 to 350 word limit. Sorry, I missed that question. What is the study site? So a study site are the places where the research would have been undertaken. So that would be either community-based setting, a workplace setting. The earlier example I gave about medical legal, the study site may be a hospital ward and the records of that hospital ward, etc. So study sites are where the actual research was undertaken. So where people have undertaken empirical, experimental research, field research, the study sites will be communities, workplaces, hospitals, clinic, etc., etc. Where research was undertaken in on a literature on electronic databases, then you would not have a study site because the focus and the source from which the data was extracted may be from journals, books, electronic databases, etc. In that situation, you would not necessarily have a study site. So that would be some examples of what study sites are. They primarily apply to field research and experimental research that people have undertaken. Yes, so the abstract, it varies. Yes, the abstract is traditionally submitted with the final paper. So again, most journals with electronic submission, you would then be expected to follow the electronic submission format and the procedure, and you would then write the abstract as per the word count and the structure that the editors will give you, and then submit your paper again within the word count, etc. And then you would submit the abstract and the paper. It would be, in most cases in the world today, it's an online submission. But the key message that I tried to convey in my presentation this evening is that the title, the abstract, and the word count are absolutely critical. If they do not fulfill the criteria and the approach that I've suggested in my presentation tonight, then the chances of rejection by the editors of that journal or the conference people, the chance of rejection would be high because you have not captured adequately in the title and the abstract and the keywords what your study and what your final paper is about. So the abstract, the words I've used, is it's a lens or a snapshot or an overview of your entire paper, and that has to be very carefully thought through and written with a lot of attention to detail along the lines that I've outlined. Mini dissertation in public and not public. Okay, so again, I would suggest that the descriptive abstract in a mini dissertation would probably be suitable for public admin, etc., for a mini dissertation. But again, my suggestion would be you would have to be guided by your supervisor and by your lecturers as to what would be acceptable. But usually for a mini dissertation, a descriptive abstract would be sufficient. Is the abstract the same? Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you for that, Anonymous. Yes, let me just clarify. Again, what I've done is given you a generic overview of how to write an abstract. So let me address this question directly. There are different terms that different journals may use. Most journals would use the word abstract, but sometimes they use the word summary, which is just more or less the same thing. Then in grant proposals and in other documents, like a monograph, if you're writing a report, not a journal article, if you're writing a report, then there may be another term that is used, which is called an executive summary. So an executive summary or a summary is exactly the same as an abstract but it may have a longer step. So if you're writing, let's say you're writing a 50 to 200 page monograph or a booklet, a book, etc., then the abstract could be at least 1 or 2 pages or up to 3 pages, etc. So that would be the same as a summary or an executive summary, but that would be for a 20-page, 50-page, 200-page document, a publication, a monograph, etc., etc. Whereas for a journal article, which is usually between 5,000 or 7,000 words, usually double spacing, which is usually about 25 pages, the abstract has to be within approximately 300 to 350 word limit. So those are the different terms that people use. Is all the disciplines have to be marked through? No, all the different disciplines, particularly in the social sciences versus the health sciences and the natural sciences, have different formats for abstract, and they will be marked through the abstract. That is correct, yes. So different disciplines will have different styles and requirements for abstracts. Absolutely correct, yeah. So again, I've repeatedly stressed, you have to start with the editorial triad, look at what are the requirements by the editor or the conference people, and then decide. Is it necessary to write all your research questions? No, not necessary at all. You must capture the primary research question. What is the most important research question? And that is what you must capture. That's all. You don't need all the questions, just the one primary research question, succinctly, concisely, within the word limit that you have. Clear, good, thank you very much. This is basically what we have to do with the research proposal for approval. Yes, of course. For a research proposal, you would also be required to write an abstract, and certainly for a research proposal, you would have to have an abstract also. That is correct, yeah. Can the researcher change aspects of the abstract after the trial approval step? No. Well, the answer is no, because if the editorial trial is negative, you've lost the beard. So that's why, colleagues, I spend a lot of time talking about using those words I use: novel, original, exciting, sexy, etc. Title, abstract, title, the abstract, and the keywords. You must pass through that triage and the approval step first. If you haven't written a good enough abstract, if you haven't passed it, then you've lost the opportunity. You have to go to another journal. So you can't change aspects of the abstract afterwards. Once the trial approval process is over, um, if the trial approval process is positive, it's been accepted, yes, you can certainly edit the abstract further and make some minor changes, etc. You can't make radical changes, but yes, in the final version, you can make changes and add to that. Yes, it is important that you did write up acceptable. Does the abstract contain brief literature review? No. Again, the key golden rule, colleagues, is the word limit, 300 to 350. It usually does not allow you to have the literature review at all, most in the majority of abstracts at all. So the short answer is no, no brief literature review. The session is clean for you. Have helped me to tense. Okay, that's good. Please, how is the abstract of our thesis? Yes, your abstract of your thesis will also be written just as well as what I've outlined. Yes. What is the usefulness in criminal justice forensic? Yes, I think forensic investigation will follow the earlier comments I had about the legal papers, etc. You would have to then write it according to what I've mentioned a little earlier. Can the title be different from the original title? Yes, the title of the abstract or the paper can be modified from the original title of the research study. Absolutely, it can be done so, yes. But obviously, it will be very similar and capture the essence of your research study. Can you give an example of oversession? Yes. So, for example, recently in Durban, we had, you probably all know about the unrest that we had in our country. And some of the newspapers have headlines such as massacre, where people were killed in the unrest, etc. Now that's an over-sectionalized title using the word when, fair enough, it's unacceptable to kill people, and even one person is not acceptable, etc. But some of the newspapers and some of the papers were using the word massacre, so that would be an example of over-sectionalized titles. What do you mean by acknowledgement in the abstract? No, sorry, acknowledgement doesn't necessarily go in the abstract at all. Very little. You have to include acknowledgement of the source. So again, colleagues, to answer that question, you have to be guided by what the editors require. Usually you don't put acknowledgement in the abstract, but if some journals require to indicate where did you get your conflict of interest. So let me give you an example of acknowledgement. If you receive money, this is a classic example which is unacceptable. If you receive money from drug companies or the tobacco industry and you do not declare that in your paper, then that is unethical behavior. So often journals are very fussy, and I can give the example of tobacco industry, which are promoting certain types of research to promote tobacco consumption. That would be an example where you have to declare conflict of interest. Is there a difference between abstract for thesis and others? Yes, very much so. And again, for a thesis, you would have the word count would be much longer because your thesis could be anything from 80 pages to 200 to 300 pages. So an abstract for a thesis would be very different, and it could be up to 1.5 to 2 pages, which is called a summary or an abstract. Whereas for a journal article, it will be within the 300 plus or minus 300 word count limits. Okay, colleagues, I'm waiting for any more comments, feedback. And I'm waiting for also feedback from Dinio. I'm not sure if there's any further, making sure I haven't missed anything. Okay, colleagues, there's no further any new questions. Can we conclude the session now, Dinio? Bronwyn?
Prof, if there are no other questions, you may go ahead and continue.
Okay, colleagues, thank you very much. Please note, as it is standard practice with myself, I'm happy to answer any other questions from Prof. Tennyson or from Dinio or Bronwyn. If there's any other question after the session, I'm more than happy in emails or whatever to answer and guide you individually on that. Thank you, colleagues, for your time and attention, and it's been a pleasure sharing this evening with you and the presentation. Thank you, colleagues, and bye-bye and good night.